Before anybody reads any sort of literature, I think it's super important to actually understand how that literature functions. What type of literature it is a question that a lot of people don't ask whenever they're reading religious literature, whether it be in Judaism, Christianity, Islam. And I think an error that a lot of people kind of fall into is thinking that the Bible is one book, let alone one literary genre. And so we don't really take the time to understand the genre, and therefore it's really kind of hard to see how that literature functioned to the people for whom it was written, for the people who actually wrote that literature, and then for people today who continue to find this literature not only just fascinating and interesting from a historical perspective, but informative and spiritually and theologically uplifting from a religious perspective. So I want to look a little bit at the Gospels and try to see if we can understand a little bit in some more depth as to how this literature functioned, what type of literature it was in the ancient world, and so on and so forth. So a few introductory things. You know, the Gospels are really at the heart of the New Testament. Of course, by now you probably already know that there are four of them. The word gospel in Greek is the word euangelion, and that just means good news. So these books, these four books, are really about the good news of the incarnation of Jesus, of the arrival of the kingdom of God, so on and so forth. So the word gospel in and of itself is simply a word that means good news. And these are unique on the one hand, and then they're not unique on the other. So there are some unique characteristics of the Christian Gospels. Of course, these are the main source. These are the epistemology for the understanding of the life and the teachings, the death and resurrection of Jesus. We don't really have a ton of extra biblical sources about the life, the death, and the resurrection and the ministry of Jesus. And so therefore, then Christians think that they encounter God in these texts, that Jesus is the full revelation of God. And yet there are four gospels. Each of them are unique, and that's a really fancy way of saying that they disagree at certain points, that they don't tell stories in the exact same way, that they get and I use this term very loosely, so please don't take it literally. They get their facts mixed up a little bit. And for some people, that's problematic. But in the ancient world, and I even think today, if you have a good understanding, it really doesn't need to be. So, what genre then are the Gospels? A lot of people don't take the time, as I said earlier, to ask this question. However, I'm going to propose that they are not modern biographies. So if you read a modern biography, I think that a lot of us are looking for names, dates, facts, maybe some context to why things happened. But what we're really looking for is kind of a chronological event of what happened, why it happened, how it happened, so on and so forth. So after somebody is in office for a while, generally the president will write a memoir of some sort, or after somebody who has worked in the State Department or had like a very competitive or very interesting career or life, they will write a biography. And those generally consist of names and dates and facts. And again, like I said, a little bit of context as to why things happened. But the Gospels, I'm going to argue, are not modern biographies. So if you need to stop the video for a second and write some of this stuff down, I'm going to try to show you guys what's important here. That the ancient biographies, and I'm going to see if I can underline a couple of things. So the ancient biographies are prose narratives. An ancient Greco-Roman biography are prose narratives that are recounting an individual's life. Okay, so we can compare the Christian Gospels to a lot of the ancient Greco-Roman biographies of the day and notice remarkable similarities. So they were, again, prose narratives. They were recounting an individual's life. Sorry, forgive that line. And there were numerous subgenres. Okay, so there were numerous subgenres. Sorry, I can't say that word today. That the text utilizes, that the authors utilize to really make their point across, or to really get their point across. But why did they write them? Here's kind of where you need to start to understand this. So as to reflect on important aspects of his or her character. Okay, these Gospels, again, sorry, I'm trying to do this on my trackpad and it's not working very well. These Gospels really, the ancient world really was concerned with unpacking the main character's character. What type of individual was this person? Were they virtuous? Were they worthy of worship? Were they worthy of being followed? So on and so forth. So please take just a second and recognize that the vast majority of these Gospels were written, these ancient Greco-Roman biographies were written to unpack and to reflect upon the important aspects of the main character's character. Generally for a few reasons. Number one, for instruction. Okay, to instruct people is to inform them as to what kind of individual, again, this person was, focusing on the character. Exhortation, to urge other people to act similarly. So again, we can compare the Gospels to other ancient Greco-Roman biographies, and they are very similar because many of them argue that this individual, for whomever this ancient Greco-Roman biography was written, is worthy of being followed. And you see that in the Gospels and you see that in other texts as well. And then finally, for propaganda. Now, that doesn't need to have the negative connotations that we often give that term. But what we're really meaning is to show that individual's superiority to his or her rivals. Okay, I'm borrowing this from, I think, a really well-respected and a really good New Testament scholar named Bart Ehrman, who has dedicated his whole intellectual life to understanding the ancient world, to understanding early Christianity, so on and so forth. So does that mean that in these Gospels that we're not getting a whole bunch of facts? Does that mean that the Gospels are not primarily intended to say, Jesus did this, and this, and this, and this, and this happened, this happened, this happened? But rather, each of these four bodies of literature are trying to unpack important aspects of the main character, in this case, Jesus's character. The main character's virtue, who this individual was. Is he worthy of worship? Is he worthy of being followed? And that this individual is superior to his peers. So does that mean that the text is a little bit less concerned with, with the facts? Well, maybe. And it's probably more concerned with understanding who this individual was and why they were really important. Understand that ancient Greco-Roman religious biographies is really kind of the best way to understand this literature. Let's look in a little bit more detail as to some of the natural characteristics of this text. So the Gospels were written anywhere from about 35 to 60 years after the death of Jesus. And so these were really based on oral and written sources. As you will see, these were not written immediately after the death of Jesus. These stories developed over time. Even Luke says when he was writing his gospel that he was looking at a whole bunch of other sources and he wanted to write his own. And we're going to talk about this here in just a second in a slightly different way too. So they were less concerned with relating historical events than they were with demonstrating the character of the main figure. So again, we've already talked about this in some detail. But what am I not saying? I'm not saying that everything in the Gospels did not happen. Okay, I'm not saying that at all. What scholars argue here is that they are less concerned with just stating the facts, and they are far more concerned with making use and utilizing literature for the best purposes of getting a substantive, a theological, and a real points across. And again, I'll show you that here in a little bit. To reiterate this again, the Gospels, these biographies, were really meant to highlight the main aspects of the person's character, not for the sake of providing history, but for giving instruction and proper behavior. How do you follow this individual? Now, what's interesting, in the ancient world, they didn't really utilize character development. Early on in the Gospels, the authors will tell you who they believe this individual was. So we have what we call the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels, synoptic just is a Greek word meaning kind of like seen together. And so we call Matthew, Mark, and Luke the Synoptic Gospels. And let me show you here that we have a little bit of a problem, if you will, that we have these three Gospels that are very, very, very similar in many ways, and yet they they don't tell stories exactly the same way. In one of the Gospels, Jesus feeds 5,000 people. In the other gospel, he feeds 4,000 people. Why is there that discrepancy? At the resurrection narratives, one gospel has two angels, one gospel has two men dressed in white. The other gospels kind of portray these stories very differently. And so, as we've talked about in class, most scholars think that the Gospel of Mark was the first gospel written, probably between the years 65 and 70. Now, we think there are also that there was another source, kind of a sayings gospel that we now call Q, which is just a short abbreviation for the German word meaning source. And since I don't speak German very well, and I assume that you might not either, a lot of scholars just call it Q. So Q was probably predated Mark, and Mark, however, did not have Q to write Mark's gospel. So we know that Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source. Now ask yourself, why is that? Okay, we've talked about this in class too. It's because Matthew and Luke have almost direct similarities to to Mark. So we know that they use Mark as a source. Now also, Matthew and Luke have stuff in their gospels, have literature in their gospels that is not found in Mark, and therefore we know that that came from Q. So Matthew had his own influence in certain places. Luke had his own influence in different in certain places. And so to say that these are really synoptic gospels, on the one hand, is very true. They are very similar to each other, and yet they are really quite unique. And so, the Gospel of Matthew, please recognize that we do not know the name of these authors. That was ascribed a few hundred years after the death of Jesus, after these were written. But we can probably guess a few things here. So Matthew is the most Jewish of all of the Gospels. It was probably written after the fall of the temple in the year 75 to around the year 85. And its intended audience was probably to a mix of Jewish and non-Jewish Christians. Why does Matthew sit at the very first book of the New Testament? Well, it really is, like I said, the most Jewish of the Gospels. The vast majority of what Jesus does in the Gospel of Matthew is to fulfill what the scriptures had predicted, according to some scholars, to fulfill what the Old Testament had hoped for, the Hebrew Bible had hoped for. And that was for a Messiah, a Jewish Messiah, to come and to liberate God's people. Now, was Jesus the violent revolutionary that many of the Jews wanted? No. However, the author of the Gospel of Matthew is really quite clear that Jesus was the fulfillment of the Jewish hope and the Jewish expectation. So the Gospel of Mark. Mark was probably written by a less Jewish individual and probably much more of a Greek or a Gentile individual. And this is the earliest one. So it was written probably around the year 65 to 70. The reason we know that is the temple was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 of the Common Era. And whenever the Gospels talk about the temple, we can kind of gauge whether they were written before the destruction of the temple or if they were written after the destruction of the temple. We know early on that the Christians were being persecuted by Rome, especially by Emperor Nero, whose persecution was in the 60s. And so it's interesting that if you look at a lot of this literature, it was written at a time when Christians were being persecuted. Early on in the gospel, the opening line, Mark's thesis, is that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And so in this gospel, the vast majority of what Jesus does is to fulfill what it means to be the Son of God. Mark has a couple of really interesting components to it. One, there's this kind of a bit of secrecy. In the Gospel of Mark, it's interesting that like demons, people who are evil, they are the ones who recognize who Jesus is, not his followers, not a lot of the Jews, but it's the demons that Jesus casts out. And so whenever somebody says, "Oh, you are the Christ," Jesus says, "Don't tell anybody." Okay, why is that? We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in class. But in the first century, if you were going to have such a following that Jesus garnered, your ministry is going to be really quick. It's going to be pretty short because the Romans are going to get wind of it and they're going to try to stop it. Mark really emphasizes more of the humanity of Jesus, and Jesus is like the suffering servant. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in class too. The Gospel of Luke is really a unique and very interesting gospel. It was written later probably than, or the latest of all three of the synoptics, and it was written by again a Gentile who converted to Christianity. Luke is the same author who wrote the gospel or the book of Acts. And audience, this was actually written to a guy named Theophilus, whose name really just means the lover, one who loves God, the lover of God. And what's interesting about Luke's gospel is Jesus is far more concerned about the liberation of the poor and the oppressed in the Gospel of Luke. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is fulfilling the scriptures. Jesus is like a spiritual leader. But in Luke, Jesus is a social justice advocate. He is one who is working on behalf of the poor to liberate them from their oppression. And we're going to see this in the work that we do in the class. So there is priority given to the sick, to the sinners, to the poor, to the oppressed, to the outcasts, and so on and so forth. And finally, we have the Gospel of John. John is not one of the synoptic Gospels. Please be sure that you're aware of that. John was written probably the latest of all of the Gospels. And we really don't know who wrote it. There's a lot of intellectual speculation out there, but we really know that this was probably the latest of the Gospels. And what's interesting is the Gospel of John was written to people who would believe in Jesus and have never met him, have never seen him. Again, this was written between probably 90 and 100 of the Common Era. And so these people, of course, had never seen Jesus. And so it was really written to a people who would not have any sort of interaction with Jesus whatsoever. In the Gospel of John, Jesus does not perform miracles. He actually performs not a ton, but a few signs. And what scholars kind of do is they talk about, well, the early part of the Gospel of John is the book of signs to show that Jesus is the Messiah. To reveal Jesus' identity. And then the second half is really, he turns towards Jerusalem, and the second half of John is really just towards the passion of Jesus, the death, the suffering, the death, the resurrection, and the ascension of Jesus. And one thing that's really interesting about the Gospel of John is John really focuses on what we call a high Christology. Whereas Mark focuses on like the humanity of Jesus, John uses very poetic language, very good prose to talk about the divinity of Jesus. And we call this, again, high Christology, a term really to describe how John proclaims from the very beginning that Jesus is the eternal Word made flesh. In the beginning was the Word, John begins, and the Word was made, or the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. Like this beautiful narrative of Jesus coexisting with God throughout all the time. And then for us and for our salvation, he became incarnate from the Virgin Mary, so on and so forth. And we're going to conclude, or this is just kind of for your own individual work if you want to look at this. Compare the birth narratives of Jesus in Matthew and then in Luke. Okay, they are very, very different. They are written from a different perspective. One focuses from the perspective of Mary, and that is the Gospel of Luke. One focuses from the perspective of Joseph, and that is the Gospel of Matthew. They have different visitors. There are different cities that are referenced. But what's interesting is these are the only Gospels that have birth narratives. Mark and John do not. So this is, again, another way to get you thinking. Is the purpose of a birth narrative to say exactly how Jesus was born, when, where, why, how, all of that stuff? Or is it to set the stage, to allow the author to unpack unpack his overall thesis, his overall argument as to who this individual was and why he was important? So let me go all the way back here. It's going to take just a second. That this literary genre is an ancient Greco-Roman biography. As Bart Ehrman argues, ancient Greco-Roman biographies, they were prose narratives really recounting an individual's life for the purpose of reflecting important aspects of the main individual's character. principally for three reasons: for instruction, for exhortation, and then for propaganda. So I hope this gives you a pretty good introduction to the literary genre of the Gospels, and then we're going to be diving into a bit more detail in class to help you kind of get a deeper understanding of these.